Welcome back. Last video we talked about classes, how to read errors and comments. We also briefly discussed inheritance and scriptable objects. In this video, we'll finally discuss access levels and cover new topics like methods. We left off last video with an error in our start method. Unlike the previous issue, we're not assigning an incorrect data type to this variable. The issue has to do with access levels. Yes, we're actually finally talking about access levels. Access levels tell our code the level of freedom the rest of our code has in accessing that particular element. If we look at our code, all elements except our methods are marked as private. So that means that only things inside our class can access these variables. You may wonder why our methods don't need to be marked with an access level. Well, I haven't been telling the entire truth. I mentioned before that by default, our variables should be labeled as private. We shouldn't have them as anything else unless we have a reason for them not to be private. That's all true, but not only should it be the default, it is the default. If you don't assign an access level to an element, it will automatically default to being private. So we don't actually need to put private behind all these data types. It really is just a preference whether you want to put the private or not. The other most common access level we'll use is public. And to me, having the public access level without the private looks weird, but it's all just aesthetics. The most important thing is to be consistent. If you're going to use private, use it everywhere. If you're not, don't use it anywhere. If we go back to our issue in the code, you'll be able to see that our IntelliSense is saying that the story text variable is inaccessible due to its protection level. Let's look at our story block and you'll see that our story text is in fact set as private, but we want to access it in our game logic class. So we actually do want this to be public. If we set this to public and return to our game logic script, you'll see that the error is now fixed. However, we have a new problem that isn't immediately recognizable and could potentially never be a problem. And the problem is that not only can we get the story text variable inside our story block, but we can also set it. Okay, so why is that a problem? Well, we don't want to do that. If we want to change our story text, we can just create a new story block with different text and put that into our TextMesh Pro text field. But that doesn't fully explain what the issue is. We can write code to set the story text as nothing. And if we try to re-access the story text, we won't get anything because we changed the story text to nothing. So you might think, okay, I just won't do that. and that's fair for a small game like this, but what happens when you're working on a larger game and you have 100 different classes and inside each class you have 50 to 100 different variables? That's potentially 10,000 different variables that you have to remember not to change. Or maybe you can change. Sometimes it's okay to set something as public and allow things to change it. So 10,000 different variables where some you can change and some you can't. And some variables are accessed by multiple classes. And if you change something incorrectly, it breaks the entire code. So now you have to look through your 100 different classes to determine what broke where. It creates a whole mess. So this is where the concept of writing clean code comes from. A majority of writing clean code is preventing yourself from making mistakes in the future. In this case, maybe it's not a big deal because this is just one class talking to another, but we should write clean code from the beginning so we don't build bad habits. Okay, so that being said, how can we make it so we can get our story text but not change or set our story text? This is where I'll introduce you to methods. A method is a piece of code that will run whenever we ask it to run. So if we look at our game logic script, you'll see that we have a start method and an update method. I want to make something really clear right now. You might be looking at the comment above each of them and be thinking that's how we ask the code to run. It's not. We personally never ask these two methods to run because Unity is asking the code to run for us. So we never see where the methods are being asked or called to run. This is one of the benefits of using Unity as a game engine. Unity does a lot of work for us without us having to do anything. We'll learn how to call a method in a little bit, but right now let's learn how to write a method. Let's break down our start method. Just like a variable, we assign an access level to our method. We don't have one in this case, meaning it defaults to private. The next piece is our return value. A return value is the data type we expect to get back to the place we called our method once it's finished running. In a lot of cases, you'll see void As you know, void just means nothing. This means that you don't want anything to be sent back after the method finishes running. The next thing is going to be the name of the method, and as you can see, this isn't written in camel casing. Methods and classes are both written in Pascal casing. Pascal casing is every first letter of every word capitalized without any spaces. Like with variables, you don't have to do this. The code won't break if you don't write in Pascal casing. You can name a method whatever you want, but this is common practice and you should write classes and methods like this. It just makes code easier to read. After, you'll notice the open and closed parentheses. This is where you can create your parameters. We won't be talking about parameters in this video, but we will use and cover them in a later video. On line 15, you'll see an open curly brace, and on line 18, you'll see a closed curly brace. Everything between this open and closed curly brace is what we're telling our method to do when it's called. In this case, we're telling our story.text variable to be set to our beginning story block.storytext before the first frame update. And that's it. That is the structure or syntax of a method. So let's go to our story block script and start writing a method to get our story text from this class to our game logic class. So first off, let's change our public to private because we don't want anything besides our Unity editor to change this variable. Now, below the variables, let's start writing our method. Usually we would write private, but in this case, we actually want other classes to be able to access this method. So let's change this from private to public. So again, after the access level, we want our return value. In this case, we want to get the story text variable from this class, which is a string. So let's write string. Then after our return value, we have to name it. Just like with variables, names should be brief but meaningful. But unlike variables, we don't want to write in camel casing. We want to write in Pascal casing. So what do we want to do with this method? Well, we want to get our story text from this class. So a good descriptive but brief name would be get story text. Then after, we write our parentheses, which could hold some parameters. We still don't know what parameters are at this point, so don't worry too much about that. And then after, we have our open and closed curly braces. And now everything inside these braces will run whenever we call this method. Once we finish writing that, you'll notice that our method name is giving us an error. And if we hover over it, we'll see storyblock.getStoryText, not all paths return a value. This is just telling us that we promised when we wrote our method that we would return a string, but we're not returning a string anywhere inside the method. Or I think a better way to say that is that we're not returning a string everywhere inside our method. But we'll get to that difference in a later video. But basically, it's just upset with us because we're not giving it a string to return. So to fulfill our promise of a string, we have to write the return and the data we want to send. So let's write return story text and close it off with a semicolon. All we're doing here is whenever this method is called, it will grab the story text variable and return it. And since this method exists inside the class, it doesn't break the private access level. Because the method is public, we can call it outside the class without breaking the access levels. Let's go back to our game logic script. Now you can see we're getting the same story text error, but we don't want to access the variable directly anymore. We want to access the get story text method. Just like a variable, we still need the dot. But after, we write our method instead, which is get story text. We also need to write our open and close parentheses whenever we call a method. To call a method is very similar to getting a variable, except we add the parentheses to say that we want the method to run. That's it. Now we can access the story text variable indirectly, meaning we don't have to worry about accidentally overwriting our text because there is no way to do that. This makes our code safer and cleaner to work with. Now, if we save and look back inside the Unity editor, we should be able to get our story text from the story block to our Text Mesh Pro component. So let's hit play and we're getting an error because I forgot to assign our beginning story block inside our game logic component. So let's just drag it in, and now we should see our story text from our story block. And we do. Now that we have our main story text able to be changed by our story block, we want to do the same thing for our buttons. The difference with how we built our code is that our button options are held within an array of strings. So to be able to interact with that easier, I think it's a good idea to put our buttons into an array as well. And that way you can also have flexibility with how many buttons you can have on your screen. You can easily create another button if your story has 5 options and put that into the buttons array. So let's create a new array of buttons for our buttons. We want to make this accessible in our Unity editor, so we can just drag our buttons into this array. You probably already know we have to use the serialized field attribute to do that. Again, let's write private because we don't want this array to be accessed beyond this class, and the data type we'll use is a class named button. And we want to make this an array, so let's put in our open and close square brackets. And I think a good name for the buttons array is just buttons. Makes sense, and it's short. Okay, cool. But as you can see, our button class is throwing an error. Just like the TMP text class, this button class exists in a namespace we're not accessing. The namespace we want to access is called unityengine.ui. So let's write that above our GameLogic class. Now you can see that our button class no longer throws an error. Okay. Great, let's move back to our Unity editor and drag our buttons into this buttons array inside our GameLogic game object. And as a reminder, our element goes up to 3, but we have 4 elements because we start counting at 0. We covered a lot of concepts in this video about why we want to write clean code, methods, and access levels. Before we close off this video, I want to give a small challenge, just like with our story text string inside our Storyblock scriptable object. I would like for you to create a method that returns our options array. Hopefully, if I did a good job explaining what everything meant, this should be a fairly easy task for you to complete. If you're struggling, don't worry, I'll help you through it once you give it a try. Okay, to create our method, we want to first give it the public accessibility level. But unlike our story text, we're not returning a string, we're returning an array of strings. So to do that, let's write string and then the open and closed squared bracket. Then our name, we can just follow the same convention we set for our story text. So let's name it get options, then our open and close parentheses and our open and close curly braces. And we want to return our options array. So let's just type return options. Great. If you had trouble with that, no worries. If you named your method something different, that's completely fine too. You can keep the name you wrote. Next video, we're going to learn how to work with our arrays and build out our Storyblock class a bit more. That will be released next week, but if you want access to that earlier, you can head over to Patreon, where that video and the rest of the series are already available. Okay, I'll see you next week.